Keith, I'd like to welcome you back to our podcast. The first time we had spoken with you was about a year ago in March. You'd originally came on. We had some great conversations about tariffs, understanding of really what they were, how they work, who holds the power, the history. I mean, you got really in depth for us, and we did a great, high level view of what these tariffs were and what was coming moving forwards, because obviously after April 1st, there was a big change in how tariffs were being used. And as we've seen over the last year, tariffs have been used repeatedly in different formats and different ways. And we really wanted to get you back on here so that we could get a better understanding again of what we've seen over the past year. Now that we're at this place in time, what are we looking at moving forwards? How have the tariffs that have been put into effect over the last year going to affect the industry? How is it going to affect people in the industry moving forwards as well? Thank you for joining us again. And if you could just do maybe a quick intro for me of sort of who you are and what your background is, because we might have some first time listeners who didn't have the privilege of hearing from you, all that time ago.
That's great. Yeah. And Chris, thanks for having me back. I really enjoyed our last time together. So I'm looking forward to this. So my name, again, Keith Prather. I'm one of the managing directors and the co-founder of Armada Corporate Intelligence, right? So we're the oxymoron company. uh, we really monitor, I mean, the elevator pitch is that we monitor the market forces that bear down on companies, and we help executives understand it enough that they can chart a strategic path through it. So we're watching everything worldwide from geopolitics and what geopolitics impact a company's operations to domestic and international economics. We're watching supply chains. We're watching raw material costs. And we're watching, silly things like the volcano on the manufacturing area. So we try to watch that whole, we call the operating footprint of a company and just help them understand it enough that they can do something about it. And the last thing I would say is we just help them try to get far enough ahead of a change that they have the time to make an adjustment or to do something a little bit different.
Appreciate that. And like always, I guess we'll just jump right into this with the questions. And first one, and as I just mentioned, we had spoken last March. So since that time frame, tariffs and trade tensions were already shaping up the supply chain. Obviously, there was a lot of forecasting of what was going to happen. What have been like the biggest developments in the US trade policy over the past year that our listeners should really understand? Because there's been a lot, let's be honest. There's a lot of things that happen quickly, things that don't happen. So if you had to, and I hate to say this, take the last 365 days and sort of boil it down to a talking point that people should really understand and what they should take away from it, really, what would that be?
Yeah, and just trying as you and I have talked about off camera, just trying to keep it as apolitical as possible. I'm not a fan or an enemy of tariffs. I mean, I think they serve a function when they're applied correctly. I think from a business perspective, what we all were hoping for and what we wanted was certainty. If we just know the rules of the game and we know what those rules are going to be over the next year to 2 years, we can plan for that. I mean, business executives are resilient, electrical contractors and construction firms and GCs are all resilient, they're smart, and they'll find a way to work around a supply chain challenge. What has really affected us over the last year has just been the on again, off again, spikes in tariffs, and then they go away for a while. Then we had the looming Supreme Court case, and that put things on hold. Supply chain managers, purchasing managers were just trying to figure out how to best game the system to make sure that, number one, they weren't sitting holding a whole bunch of inventory that had a 50% tariff on it. If the tariff was going to be 10 or 15%, 6 months later, or in a situation like we have right now, and I know we'll get into more detail about it, do they need to game it right now, thinking at a 10 or 15% tariff today? Is this going to be one of the lowest tariff environments we've got? And that by the time we get into June, July, we're looking at a much higher tariff regime. And so do they inbound products now? And I think that's the biggest takeaway I've had over the last 12 months is this volatility is making it very difficult for companies to try and manage through it. And again, whether you care about the impact of tariffs or not, it's changed the way we do business in a sense that it fundamentally makes us think differently about procuring items, staging items, carrying inventory, and even down to sourcing and where we do get products from. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about this in depth, so I won't go much further on this, other than to simply say, I feel like as we get into the end of June and July, we're going to have a little more certainty around the whole tariff issue. And I think it'll be much easier for companies to make decisions after that. In the meantime, though, we're gonna have to put up with a lot of things happening around the world.
I think uncertainty was something we had talked about last year, and it was something at that time that a lot of companies that we had spoken with were dealing with because you had, as you mentioned, there was manufacturers bringing in 6 months of supplies and onshoring it and warehousing it. There were people that were hedging their bets that it wasn't going to happen, but it was the same theme. There was a lot of uncertainty of what was going to happen. And I think the picture, what people were like, okay, April 1st, we're going to get a rollout of these retaliatory tariffs. We're going to put them into place. That's what they're going to be. We can adjust our business accordingly, adjust our pricing, and move forward. But I think the same theme that we saw then is the same theme that, as you sort of mentioned, is that uncertainty has sort of been going on because of the ups and downs of what has been occurring with the tariffs and companies not really understanding it. I know some of them, I mean, you look at, I think, what was it, Ford that lost almost $1 billion in tariffs because they were consuming some of the price of the tariffs and not passing it down, thinking that not knowing where the tariff was going to land, they didn't want to pass the cost down. And there's been other companies I've talked to in our industry that onshoring product and not passing the tariff down because they felt that, well, if this is a passing tariff, then we'll eat the cost and that way we don't have to go raise them. But then they're losing out as well as a manufacturer because you're eating that cost that you're having to pay at the port.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, I'm sorry.
No, no, you're good.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right about that whole volatility piece of it, because if we think about structurally how this works, a trade agreement will supersede the actual tariff in most cases. So it sets a fixed amount for the tariff that we impose on an entire country. So let's say we negotiate a deal with Indonesia and that deal is a 19% tariff. Going into the end of the year, a lot of companies felt like with that trade deal, at least signatured, and kind of a signatory agreement in place, that they knew what that new operating environment would be. What they
Mhm,
didn't expect is that the Supreme Court would come in and find that the old reciprocal regime was illegal and that we would be applying a brand new blanket tariff that was set at about 10%.
mhm,
So then what's happened is that a lot of those countries that have those trade agreements have now come in and said, "Well, wait a minute, why would I settle at 19% when the new Section 122s are set at 10? Maybe we see a maximum of 15 through the middle part of July, and then we don't know what the regime looks like after that. We don't know what the tariff regime looks like." And so a whole new wave of volatility kinda kicked
mhm,
in, and the administration, I think, wanted to use those reciprocal tariffs to ultimately get a lot of countries to get those ratified trade agreements in place, because that becomes kind of the law of the land.
mhm,
And moving forward, then, there's so much more in those trade agreements than just a fixed tariff amount. There's, agreements on what we'll export, what, they'll export, what they'll import, what we'll import, and how we're going to do business together. And so ultimately, that's what the administration was going for. It's just that the Supreme Court decision really threw a monkey wrench in the middle of all of that, and it stalled some of those trade agreements. Some countries that had agreements have now kind of backed off a little bit, but it's that whole, up and down and the uncertainty that gets created that's the problem. And then moving forward, Chris, this is a little complicated, but what the Trump administration did after the Supreme Court ruling is they impose a very rarely used Section 122 tariff. And so they're able to go in and say, we're going to apply this 10% tariff to all countries. There's a maximum ceiling of 15% that they can apply to those countries, and it can only last for 150 days. So we hit July, and the Section 122s go away. So they have to replace it with something. And what they replace it with is either a Section 301 or 232. And those are well tested, tariff policies that we can put into place. The one thing about the 301s is that it requires an investigation first. and that gives it more legal staying power after the fact. So once we do get a Section 301, we know we'll probably, probably be able to hold some legal rigor, which means once we get the 301 decision, you can kind of almost set that in stone as that's going to be the new way forward, and we'll get that ratified. Right now, we have two different types of 301s that are being proposed, and they're blanket across an entire country. And there's two different methodologies they're using. One is that countries that we believe have done human rights violations will get a 301 of a certain amount. And then countries that are more trade partners get a different type of 301 tariff that's based more on what we call unfair trade practices, right? It's like they're overproducing in some industries and dumping those products on the open market, and that creates an unfair trade advantage. And so we will be applying one of those two 301s. They're in the We'll be in the public comment phase in late March and then through the middle part of April, with the decision coming down probably by late April, early May, maybe by mid-May. We'll probably say mid-May before we get a decision what those 301s look like, what the amount is, who it gets applied to, and we'll learn a lot about it through the investigation phase. But by the time we get to July, those 122s will get replaced with the 301s, and then that'll be kind of the new law of the land. And what we think the administration is going to do, just one last little thought, is we think they'll try and set the 301s at a level that's just a little bit higher than what those trade agreements would establish for those countries. So what he could do is go into like the Philippines, for instance, and set a 301 that could be a 20% tariff and say to the Philippines, sign the trade agreement that we already had in place with you. Sign it, ratify it, let's make it a legal document, because that reestablishes the tariff at 15%. And that'll be the new way forward with the Philippines, right? So I think ultimately that's where we end up. We ultimately end up legal trade agreements, and then the 301 either just gets an exemption for that country or kind of goes away. And I think that's where we end up. So, bottom line for electrical contractors, I think we get to the point where we're seeing about a 15% average tariff rate. And to your point, if you think about just all those up and down the supply chain, from the supplier overseas to the transportation company to the inbound domestic transportation, we can eat 15% up and down that supply chain. So the end consumer really doesn't feel it.
Now, real quick, before we move on to 301s, because this is one of the first times I've heard about it. Obviously, I've heard regarding the new tariff options that the administration may have moving forwards, but not really into detail. If we can just grab a few quick facts from you so people sort of understand them a bit better. You mentioned with the 301 that it has to be investigated ahead of time and go through procedures, I'm guessing. Is that investigation being done through Congress, or is it done through an internal department of revenue or something of that within the government itself?
It'll probably come out of the U.S. trade, the USTR. So it's going to be one of the trade committees, but there will be linkages into Congress there. So Congress will have some say. The bigger thing is that rather than just like a political move, they can go in and they're going to be building the fact base to say, here are the idiosyncrasies of that particular trade relationship or what that country is doing. So it'll call it out. It makes it more factual rather than just, I didn't like the way President Xi looked at me yesterday, so tariffs now 60%.
Yeah.
It'll be based on them dumping products, real trade data, real violations, and some are going to be a little looser because some will be human rights based, which is
Yeah.
more of a judgment call, right? And those will be more slippery. The ones that are unfair trade practices will be more data driven and data based, and that's why I think they stand up to more legal rigor most of the time if they get
Yes.
challenged.
Okay. Now, who would ratify the 301s? Would it be the trade groups that would just say, figure it all out? Or did they put this all together and package it and then bring it to Congress and go, okay, here's the facts, here's why we're doing what we're doing. And then Congress goes, yeah, you're good to go.
It doesn't require full congressional ratification. Okay, so it can be either a subset of Congress, it can be a committee, it can be the U.S. Trade Representative. So, but it does have again those congressional goes into it where there is some say. I think anything right now that would go in front of Congress would get defeated. It's just
Yeah,
we can't even
yeah,
get the airports opened up. So yeah,
yeah.
I
Would just
it would be dead on arrival there.
okay.
So
So this is sort of outside that voting of Congress to ratify, and it's more within these trade portions of the government to say, here's the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. Here's the facts, black and white, of the reason why we're doing it. And then they're sort of justifying ahead of time which one they're getting within those 301s. But it doesn't need to go through congressional approval for those to go be enacted at that point.
yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
And then
And I
when
could be wrong. We'll have to go research this afterwards.
Um, and then when they're enacted, how long would these be in place? Are these another 150 days? Or are these are good to go? They're going to be in place for as long as we foresee, or somebody else comes changes it.
That's it. They'll be indefinite. So once they're put into place, they're in place. Now, they can be you can get exemption. Okay. So if an industry comes together, a particular trade group, they can go lobby against the USTR, the US Trade Representative, and they can say, we're facing some undue harm here. Can we get an exemption for a specific product or a specific commodity? And then that's where we would go with the next phase. I will say in the first Trump term, there were about 55,000 filings for exemptions, tariff exemptions, and they granted a little over 10,000 of those exemptions. So what we moved from is a little bit of complexity because we'll have to be monitoring those exemptions. And when those exemptions get released, there's usually not a huge press release saying,
Mhm.
hey, a certain product has been granted an exemption. You have to go out and you have to watch
Got it.
and see when you're
Got it.
eligible to take that exemption. Yeah. So
So with this though, with the lobbying portion that you just mentioned, so it's a NEMA and NED and NEMRA and IBEW or NECA, they all came together with their representatives and they went up to Washington. They were like, hey, listen, we're essential. Our industry is essential. We're popping up data centers left and right, and well, they run on electricity. And you need us now to build for each data center, according to the Trump administration's executive order, their own independent power grid. So now we're going to have to build these power plants and power grids for this data center that takes an absorbent amount of power every day and electricity. Everything that we're going to be using, which is predominantly what's going on in this industry right now, is vital to national security based on what the current administration's policies are saying. Could they walk into Washington and say, our particular industry, no matter where we're bringing it in from China to Vietnam to the Philippines to Mexico, that this particular subset of product types that are going into these particular industries can be recused from any of the tariffs that are ongoing or the tariffs that might go into place with the 301s in the future?
yeah, absolutely. And I think what happened there, and I don't know anything for, so I'm guessing here. Okay, but I believe what happened was the administration probably said behind the scenes, maybe to somebody, look, we've got the Supreme Court decision that's looming. We need to wait to see what happens with that. And then we have a new tariff that we're going to impose. We need to see what happens with the Section 122s. And then we'll rule on a 301 after that. And then we'll work on exclusions. And so I have a feeling all that lobbying effort probably starts to make a difference, but it won't start to make a difference until maybe, late Q2, Q3 at the earliest. I
Got it.
think they wanted to wait until all the smoke cleared so that they knew what the operating authority was going to be moving forward before
Yeah.
they could then go in and say, well, we'll give you an exemption on this particular you know, piece of electrical equipment.
But
Um,
it seems like just at this point, any, I guess, representative of any of the industry's channel partners here should be sort of sitting down at a round table now that we've gotten through the Supreme Court. We see what's sort of occurring at this point, what's in place at this moment will be running up. And like you said, in July, you would think they'd be kicking down the door in Washington and lobbying every single person that they can within these trade representatives to say, hey, you guys are the ones sort of pushing the policy on AI. AI is pushing the marketplace. It's pushing the stock market. It's really fueling everything that's going on in the American economy right now. our guys can't be sitting here also dealing with tariff uncertainty or anything. Is there an exception that can be made? Because, like you said, I mean, by the time 15% comes across the board and gets down to a contractor, that can be shed across every touch point with a little bit of finger grease or pencil erasing or marking up something, marking it down where that 15% really felt by the end between the onshoring and, distribution. They can usually disperse that between other costs that they have within their business. But do you think it's something where these representatives for these groups should be there trying to at least get any kind of tariff at all being put onto these type of products removed or at least considered before these 301s take effect so that they can be understanding the impact that these have across the industry and deliver that certainty that everybody in the electrical and lighting industry is really looking for at this time?
Yeah, and I do know for a fact that those lobbying efforts that they're working it as hard as they can, and I do know that they've got open doors, so the administration is hearing them. I know we did a little bit of work in the background to help with research, and what we came up with was a proposal that would phase in the tariffs so that, the problem is US production ability to ramp up production to be able to meet demand. And so you would do is impose the heavier tariffs later in the cycle. So, year one, you have a minimal tariff to try and
Mhm.
warn and say you've got 3 years to go through the actual process of building a new facility to produce that copper component.
Yep.
And then the tariff would ramp up over time to enforce that, to say, hey, we're serious about this. By year 3 or 4 or 5, it's going to be 25% tariff on that copper item. So get
Right.
serious and get your domestic production going. And again, I think timing was just the big factor there that with the Supreme Court and the noise from that, the 122 and the noise from that, I think we got to get past that before the administration will really sit down and say, okay, here's the operating environment that we know moving forward is intact. And so, yeah, let's do these exceptions and let's consider this one call out for this one industry. And then we'll kind of see how things go.
Okay. Now, with this 301, once they're put into place, it's either decided one 301 or I guess the bad guy 301. Can they come back and change that? Because as you mentioned before, with China, it was like they were at 30%, and then by the afternoon, they were at 70%, and by 2 days later, they were back to 20%, and then you're at 100% because somebody sneezed the wrong way. I'm not judging anybody, I'm just saying that is massive uncertainty for everybody. Would these 301s, once they're put into place, I know you mentioned 10% up to 15, can additional tariffs be placed on top of it, or this sort of becomes law of the land until a trade deal is put into place?
No, I mean, I believe there's some that could stack. Okay, we call stacking where you have different tariffs will stack on top of each other to create a lot
Mhm.
of pain, a lot of suffering in some industries. The art of the deal, right, where we're going and using these reciprocal tariffs to go in and inflict pain and suffering on a country to get them to do what we really wanted them to do or needed them to do. I think that was a different use of the tool. I think moving forward, I think what the administration will do is use these as more of a revenue generator in the sense that we're going to use it to either pay down the deficit or do whatever they want to do with it. Also, try to balance the market out a little bit so that we do see some U.S. build out of some capacity. I don't know how much of that we're going to achieve, but I think that is a I don't know,
Like a limit.
legitimate objective. Yeah, it's a legitimate goal. I don't know how successful it'll be. We'll see. And then I do believe though that I don't think you're going to suddenly see a 301 and then we get mad at them and then we go throw and do another investigation and 4 months later throw another 301 at them or a 232 at them. I don't know that we'll continue to do that. I've been proven wrong many, many times, right? So
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, sort of circling back here. So these 301s obviously deal with trade agreements. We've talked about trade agreements initially. We were talking about them earlier in this conversation. We talked about them last year. One of the big things that was laid out for us last March was we're doing these reciprocal tariffs to bring countries to the table to round out and create these new trade deals with each company so it's more fair for the American people and the American economy. And, we're getting our products out to industries without as high tariffs so that we have better selling potential internationally. And also by raising the tariff on international products coming in, it's going to make the market more competitive. But it seemed like the main goal was to get everybody to sit down and have trade deals with us. And that was going to create the certainty that we could live off of, like you mentioned, and move forwards with and have an understanding of where now a playing field is. But it seemed like we had put in some trade deals with certain countries, at least from my understanding of certain conversations. It became difficult with certain people, but that there were trade deals that were put into place, but that tariffs were also talked about being. But my understanding is once you have a trade deal, you're not really putting tariffs on top of the trade deal because, well, you have a deal. So if you could clarify that, because that's what I'm trying to understand is, even if these 301s come into effect and then they get exempt because they have a trade deal, can they come back and put more tariffs? Is that something that's been happening? Because it seems like once you get a deal objective and we've got our deal and we're good to go and now we can all breathe a little easily, but it also seems like we get the deal and then something happens and we go, well, you got your deal, but now you also have 15% on top of what your deal was. So the trade deal was supposed to create the certainty to take away from the uncertainty. So, am I far off that tariffs can still be imposed on trade deals, or am I incorrect in that thinking?
Well, and again, I think we're so used to doing contracts in the United States between two U.S. companies, and when you have a legal contract, there's that fear of a legal court, and we uphold our end of the contract, and you uphold your end of the contract, and that's usually kind of how things go, right? We sign and we agree. When you're dealing with 130 different countries and 130 different cultures, sometimes that legal agreement probably isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And they're going to renege on their legal contractual agreement. And we can either impose penalties on them or, it's what it's been in the past where, we just we don't like it, but we either roll on or, it's kind of a slushy relationship.
Mhm,
Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, and that's how it's been in the past. I think this time these legal agreements will put, not poison pills, but it'll put some pain and suffering in the middle of those agreements. And there will be ramifications if you don't uphold your end. So if you say you're going to buy, uh, you know, $10 billion of soybeans and you don't follow through over a contractual period of time, there are probably some ramifications that kick in. And some of those contracts may be written such, or those trade deals may be written such so that there's a tariff escalation clause in it that simply says if you don't meet these thresholds, we reserve the right to take your 15% tariff and bump it up to 20% or 25.
mhm.
And so I think each agreement is going to be very, very different and very unique. And some of our good trading partners, I think, will uphold their end of the agreement, and we'll uphold our end. But a lot of these agreements are very one-sided. There's a lot of provisions in there that finally say, hey, after all these 10, 20 years of doing business and you taking advantage of us, you're gonna meet these 5 or 6 criteria, and we're gonna continue to leave certain parts of our market open to you like they have been. It's almost like an agreement that says you're gonna have to uphold a whole bunch of ends of your side of the deal in order to be able to continue to enjoy what you've been enjoying.
Gotcha. So they could be written in, but at this point, I mean, honestly, obviously, we've all seen where tariffs have been imposed on a whim, conversations or posts based off of a slew of different reasonings. Would having the trade deal with tariffs written in as what am I looking as violations to the trade deal, will they though be able to now with a trade deal in place and the 301s and the ruling from the Supreme Court be able to come forward and say, well, we have a trade deal, but this happened today and we're throwing an extra 10%. It doesn't seem like that's going to be something that is going to continue to be able to happen because of the Supreme Court ruling and because of the 301s that they have to do the investigations ahead of time. That once we have a trade deal, it will be, unless it's written into it, there's going to be no sort of off the cuff tariffs that can be thrown on top out of nowhere. Is that
That's right.
correct?
I mean, that's right. Now, again, that could be written into the trade deal,
Yeah,
right?
but it would be expected though, so that
Right.
that it would be coming. It wouldn't just be you wake up one day, China has 60% more on top of the trade deal without prior knowledge.
Right, exactly. Now, what a lot of people are doing right now, so if you're ordering products from overseas or using a distributor or you someone who's helping you with customs brokerage, they're taking those trade agreements and they're popping them into an AI tool. They just literally
Right.
copy and paste into an AI tool and they say in there, what are the critical trigger events that I need to watch for that would change my tariff? And let AI pop back and give you 3 or 4 bullets out of that big, long, lengthy legal agreement to say, okay, well, if they don't hit this threshold or this threshold, that could trigger a 10% tariff. Or you could go in and say, out of all of these 12 or 13 different trade agreements, which ones do I need to be worried about? And, a tool can come back very simply and say, there's only one of those countries that even if it had the maximal penalty tariff imposed would even be something to worry about. The
Got
UK, for instance, if they're at 10% and maybe the penalty is it goes up 5 percentage points, you're at 15, it's not a big deal, even if they have an imposed penalty. But if it's Indonesia and their rate is 15% and the penalty kicks their tariff to 50%, then that's the one I want to go monitor and I want to pay attention to, right? I want to watch that one because that one would hurt me, you know?
yeah. So you just mentioned AI with putting these in there. And I mean, obviously it makes life a lot easier and it gives us the ability to drop these, you know, trade deals into it and set those sort of points there. Is that something that companies should be looking at, manufacturers, distributors, I mean, even down to the larger contractors and estimators and procurements within those larger construction firms that as we go forwards and we start implementing additional trade deals or the trade deals that are in place now, be able to go on to AI and say, okay, this is my industry. This is what we do. Can you tell me what trade deals are, if I'm a contractor, trade deals are currently affecting my industry? And then, as you said, going forward, to maybe set some benchmarks and you can sort of use the technology to check in once in a while to say, hey, where do we stand with reaching these benchmarks? Because then, like you said, you're aware of the volatility that might happen and it's written in there so that you're not getting caught off guard and you can sort of now start judging the market yourself and have an understanding of what may be coming in the future. Because like you said, if it's 15% and the violation is 5, you're not probably going to care as much. It can probably get dissipated throughout the chain.
Right.
If it's 15% and now it's going to be 50%, and now there's some kind of other industry factor going on raising prices as well, that 50% might make a big difference for you as an estimator looking at projects coming up in the future. So, with the use of technology, should people up and down the channel start looking at how can they can use AI as not just a chatbot or running behind the scenes for repetitive work or anything, but actually looking at setting up a way that it can tell them with these tariffs or with these trade agreements which ones affect them, and then keep sort of a watch list that they can come back to see if it hits areas that might increase those tariffs for them. Is that something you consider they should be doing?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I do hear a lot of lead users. I call them lead users. Those people out on the bleeding edge of technologies are already
Yeah,
doing that,
very
and that's
smart.
where I'm getting a lot of the ideas. Yeah, but what they're using it for is an early warning system.
Yep.
Okay, they're still ultimately going to go out and get a legal trade, like a broker who's already working with them. They're going to go get a legal kind of recommendation from that broker to say exactly what they should be worried about. But they'll use that as an early warning system on their own to
Yeah.
go in and say, what should I be watching for? And at what point in time do I need to pick up the phone and call, Frank over at the broker and say, hey, Frank, should we be worried about this? And then you not only use it for that, but then you can also use it to set it up and every day pop in and say, hey, on these things that you identified as those trigger events, were any of them flipped overnight? You know,
Yeah.
and I know people who start their days with that kind of routine. It's like I'm going to pop into my tool, I'm going to go in and say, hey, we've been working together on this. We've set up these thresholds or these trigger events, and sometimes I'll put down a Word document. You pop that Word document into the AI tool, whichever one you're using. You're saying, read
Yeah.
the document. Here's the trigger events we're looking for. Were any flipped overnight?
Gotcha.
Um, 10 seconds. That's all you
Yeah.
need. And all you're
You
looking for,
I use it every day. So if they take a prompt and have a pre-written prompt already into a Word document, an estimator, a procurement guy at a construction firm, a distributor procurement person, a manufacturer, they can walk in with just the proper prompts that are written to understand where their trigger points may be and just provide them some quick access in 60 seconds to know if they should have any concerns on what's going on daily, weekly, or monthly at least, and they could get a better understanding of how this is affecting their industry.
absolutely. And, again, if they use 10,000 items, they're not watching 10,000 items, right? Some of it doesn't matter. Bolts, fasteners, those little bitty things. You're playing the 80/20 rule. You want to look at the 20% of your supply chain that affects 80% of your revenue, right? You want to know if an electrical panel just hit a critical supply chain threshold where instead of a 12-month back order, now all of a sudden it kicks to 24 months. Or, if it had a 10% tariff, now all of a sudden it's got a 50% tariff. That's material that can stop a project,
Mhm.
and those are the things that you want to be abreast of. So again, you may be monitoring 5 or 10 items instead of the
The
10,000 you do on a
Yeah,
job site. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, there's a good quick tip for them right there. I mean, anybody in the channel can be doing this. You can go in there. I mean, you could start with just going into whatever AI you use and telling them exactly what we're talking about right now, what they're looking for. And it would give them a prompt back. Like you said, you can put it to a Word document or a reoccurring calendar that comes up every week. And you just put that prompt in there and you copy and paste it. And it'll tell you with your top 20% of your products that you're looking at, if any movement has been made across, the trade infrastructure and tariff infrastructure that's in place. And that way they can sort of keep abreast. And like you said, at least see warning signs or be more aware of what's happening. Honestly, right now we're still seeing that sort of uncertainty, but this is sort of an early warning system for them. I think you want
Absolutely.
okay. There we go.
Absolutely.
Quick
And we're
takeaway.
yeah. Yeah, we're using that like in the conflict in the Middle East and how to understand what's happening way upstream so that we know there's a ripple happening at the very top of like raw material procurement or energy usage in a supplier in Indonesia that's feeding a supplier in Vietnam that makes a product that we import into the US to go to a job site. And so we're watching it that far upstream to understand where that critical break might be in the supply chain. And so it's almost like, it's not the guy standing in front of you that's going to throw a right cross. It's the guy behind him
Yeah.
throwing the right cross that you need to duck for, and that's kind of what we think of.